Coming up, Terrence Winschel will present Crucial to the Outcome, Vicksburg and the Trans-Mississippi Pipeline. Terrence Winschel is a native of Pittsburgh and a 35-year veteran of the National Park Service, serving here at Gettysburg National Military Park, Fredericksburg's and Spotsylvania National Military Park, as well as Valley Forge National Historic Park, and recently retired as a historian at Vicksburg National Military Park. He has written 75 articles on the Civil War and more than 125 book reviews. He's author of Triumph and Defeat, Volumes 1 and 2, The Civil War Diary of a Common Soldier, and Vicksburg's Fall of the Confederate Gibraltar. Please give a warm Sacred Trust welcome to Terry Winschel.
Thanks, Brooke. Warm, of course, is the operative word in that phrase. As a Pittsburgh native and graduate of Penn State University, I'm absolutely thrilled to be back on the sacred soil of Pennsylvania and truly appreciate this warm Mississippi welcome that you folks have given me here today. Ladies and gentlemen, although honored by the kind invitation of the Gettysburg Foundation to be here today, I am more deeply honored by your presence. And thank you for this opportunity to share with one another our love of history. Out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Vicksburg National Military Park? Quite a number. Very good, very good. For those of you who have not yet had that opportunity, you're in for a real treat when you do so. Vicksburg National Military Park was established by the Congress back in 1899. It was the 5th Civil War battlefield to be set aside in perpetuity by the Congress, making it only the 7th national park. Today, Vicksburg National Military Park encompasses approximately 1,800 acres, or 2/3 of the siege and defense lines around the city. It boasts of more than 1,380 monuments, markers, tablets, and plaques, which make it one of the more densely monumented battlefields in all the world. And the monuments of stone and bronze that you shall see, similar to those you see here at Gettysburg, were executed by the foremost American and European sculptors of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and have collectively made Vicksburg, in the words of one Civil War veteran, the art park of the world. And that's a distinction of which we are immensely proud. So I do extend to each and every one of you a very cordial invitation to come visit with us in Vicksburg, because you will be in for a real treat. Before I begin my prepared remarks, allow me to share with you a quote from Major General George Gordon Meade, the commander of the victorious Union Army here at Vicksburg, who in reference to the Vicksburg campaign wrote, "Vicksburg, the second in splendor, if not the first in real consequences." And today, that's what we'll be talking about, are the consequences of the fall of Vicksburg. Rather than present to you today an overview of the operations for the fortress city on the Mississippi River, we're going to talk about its significance and the consequences of its fall. Church bells rang in joyous chorus throughout the North as news of the fall of Vicksburg spread as an electric shock across the nation. And in towns large and small, bells in city halls and county courthouses joined in glorious refrain. In the states of the old Northwest, the farmers of which region depended on unfettered navigation of the Mississippi to send their crops to world markets, the news of Vicksburg's surrender was especially well received. The success of Union arms was hailed in banner headlines from St. Louis to Cincinnati, Des Moines to Indianapolis, and Chicago to St. Paul. The victory was all the more dear to the citizens of that region, for it was primarily soldiers from their states who had shed their blood on battlefields from Fort Donelson to Shiloh, Chickasaw Bayou to Arkansas Post, and from Port Gibson to Champion Hill, who had triumphed at Vicksburg. To place Vicksburg and the campaign for control of the Mississippi River in proper perspective, modern students of the Civil War, such as you good folks here today, must understand the significance of the city and the river to the war efforts of the North and South, a significance that was clearly understood and fully grasped by Union and Confederate leaders once hostilities began. Yet, a recent article in North and South magazine mocked the significance of Vicksburg and the Mississippi River as, quote, myths by authors obviously oblivious to its realities, unquote. Pretty harsh words, I think you'll agree. This presentation will examine the significance of the Mississippi River, of Vicksburg in particular, and the vast trans-Mississippi region, and allow you to determine if it is myth or was it reality. Shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln gathered his civil and military leaders to discuss strategy for opening the Mississippi River and for ending what he termed a rebellion in the southern states. Seated around a large table, examining a map of the nation, Lincoln made a wide, sweeping gesture with his hand, then placed his finger on the map at Vicksburg and said, "See what a lot of land these fellas hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." Echoing at that time the president's sentiments relative to Vicksburg and the Mississippi River was William T. Sherman, the Union general destined to play such a prominent role in the campaign for control of the great river. "The Mississippi's source and mouth must be controlled by one government," wrote Sherman emphatically, who confessed, "To secure the safety of the navigation of the Mississippi River, I would slay millions. On that point, I am not only insane, but mad." General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck wrote of the campaign to capture Vicksburg in similar, direct, albeit less eloquent terms, "In my opinion, this is the most important operation of the war. To open the Mississippi River will be to us of more advantage than the capture of 40 Richmonds." Confederate President Jefferson Davis equally recognized the importance of the Mississippi River. Long a resident of Warren County, of which Vicksburg is the county seat, Davis was uniquely qualified to understand and appreciate the river's strategic significance to a people struggling to establish their independence. The depth of his understanding was best expressed in a letter written after the fall of Vicksburg to Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, the general responsible for the defense of the city. "I thought and still think you did right to risk an army for the purpose of keeping command of even a section of the Mississippi River," penned Davis of his conviction. "Had you succeeded, none would have blamed. Had you not made the attempt, few would have defended your course." Surrender of the Confederate Gibraltar on July 4, 1863 was the culmination of the largest and most complex land and naval operation undertaken in American military history up to that time. The campaign for Vicksburg lasted 18 months and involved almost 200,000 soldiers and the inland water fleets of the Union and Confederate navies. Such massive commitment of men and material devoted to this single objective and the duration of the campaign itself evidence that Vicksburg was a city of unparalleled significance, militarily, economically, and politically to the leaders of the North and South, a significance that was greatly enhanced after New Orleans and Memphis fell to Union forces, which left Vicksburg, in the words of Jefferson Davis, as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. "Thank God," sighed Abraham Lincoln from the depths of his very soul when word reached him of Vicksburg's surrender. "The Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea." The eloquence of his simplicity was equaled only by the exuberance of those in the combined Army-Navy force that compelled the surrender of the city. Perhaps none expressed their sentiments better than Sherman, who boldly and justifiably proclaimed, "Glory, hallelujah, the best 4th of July since 1776. His declaration could not have been more fitting had he known at that time of the Battle of Gettysburg, fought on July 1st through 3rd, which, when combined with the results of the fall of Vicksburg, marked the turning point of the war. That turning point was as obvious in Washington as it was in Richmond, where Colonel Josias Gorgas, chief of the Confederate Ordnance Department, lamented of the twin disasters. "Yesterday we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. The Confederacy totters to its destruction." Ladies and gentlemen, myths or reality aside, statements such as these provide ample evidence that Vicksburg was significant, if for no other reason than simply because the leaders of the warring sides said it was, and the people of that time period accepted that significance, whether real or imagined, and acted according to that level of significance through force of arms with violent execution. Northern jubilation, however, was overshadowed by the casualty list from Gettysburg that appeared in newspapers from Boston to New York and Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, while Southern hopes were further crushed as similar lists were published in newspapers from Richmond to Atlanta and Charleston to Jackson. The harvest of death in Pennsylvania was staggering and directly impacted more families on either side of the Mason-Dixon line than did the 20,000 Union and Confederate casualties suffered at Vicksburg. In the depth of such widespread sorrow and suffering, recognition of Vicksburg's significance began to fade almost immediately. Vicksburg's short-lived hold on prominence had been undermined during the campaign itself by a lack of newspaper coverage that failed to rivet the nation's attention on what proved to be the most decisive campaign of the war. After all, siege operations were dull, mundane, boring, and resulted in far fewer casualties than the actions at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg that occurred during that same time period. Battle action and casualties are what sold newspapers, and editors sent their reporters to more active areas of operations, whether significant or not. Photographers as well focused their lenses on scenes of death and destruction. Thus, in the rich photographic history of the war, there are numerous photographs of Gettysburg dead, as our friend Gary showed this morning, but precious few of Vicksburg, and none from the battlefields of Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, or Big Black River Bridge, actions which led up to the siege of the River City. Although the second largest city in Mississippi in 1860, and it may surprise you to know the population was only 5,000 souls, Vicksburg was far removed from the population centers of the North and South and drew little attention from people in the larger eastern cities. It was also far removed from the centers of political power in Washington and Richmond, and did not attract the same level of attention from elected officials who lived with the constant fear of enemy attack. These same officials viewed on a daily basis the sick and wounded of their respective nation's principal army, and failed to conceive of the suffering and sacrifice of their armies in the West. Further eroding Vicksburg's stature over time has been a lack of regimental histories and published diaries of those who participated in the campaign that attract the modern researcher-writer. Few Western soldiers were as literate as their Eastern counterparts, and the paucity of letters, diaries, and memoirs dim our understanding of the complexity of the war west of the Appalachian Mountains. The small number of works on the war in the West is a direct result of the lack of primary source material. However, perhaps the most influential factor for Vicksburg being relegated to secondary status in the minds of modern students of the Civil War is the immortal Gettysburg Address. Had Abraham Lincoln not accepted the invitation to give a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery here at Gettysburg, or had he delivered a Vicksburg address instead, the small town here in Pennsylvania and the battle that it witnessed would be more like Sharpsburg, Maryland today than the American Mecca that it is. These factors, and many others, contribute to Vicksburg standing in the shadow of the far bloodier but less significant action here at Gettysburg. It is all too easy for the general reader, popular historians, and students of the Civil War to accept the popular version of history. Even some academics, such as the author of that article in North and South, who are intimidated by the complexities of the campaign and failed to take the time to properly evaluate the operations that focused on Vicksburg, subscribe to the popular belief. Further diluting our understanding and appreciation for the Vicksburg campaign are television shows and epic films that are long on romance but skimp on historical accuracy. But the facts themselves remain And that's what we'll talk about here today. Though often ignored, they cannot be denied. Whereas two armies, badly bruised and bleeding, marched away from Gettysburg to fight another day, Union victory at Vicksburg was complete. In addition to taking the city and capturing a garrison of 29,500 men, the Union Army of the Tennessee, under Major General Ulysses S. Grant, seized a huge amount of military stores. Among the public property captured were 172 pieces of artillery, 38,000 artillery projectiles, 58,000 pounds of black powder, 50,000 shoulder weapons, mostly British Enfield rifles, which were arguably the finest combat weapon of the time period, 600,000 rounds of ammunition, and 350,000 percussion caps. Resources in men and materials that the South could ill afford to lose. In addition to this tally, must be added the 7,000 casualties inflicted on Southern forces during the inland phase of the campaign leading up to the siege of the River City, and 82 cannon captured as Grant's army pushed deep into the interior of Mississippi and compelled the evacuation of Southern strongholds that centered on Snyder's Bluff north of Vicksburg and Warrenton and Grand Gulf south of the city. In terms of artillery alone, and here you see many of the captured cannon, 254 cannon were captured by the federal forces during the Vicksburg campaign. Out of curiosity, does anybody remember how many Confederate cannon were captured here at Gettysburg? Any guesses? 7? Keep. Can you repeat that one more time? 0. That is exactly right. 0. These figures of 254 guns represent more than 11% of the total number of cannon cast by the Confederacy from 1861 to 1865, all lost in one fell swoop. Of this figure, 85 were heavy siege guns. In their work on Confederate cannon foundries, Larry Daniel and Riley Gunter state, even under the best of circumstances, it took some 400 to 500 hours of labor to complete a 10-inch Columbiad weighing 19,000 pounds. It took the Tredegar Iron Works, which many of you know produced fully 1/2 of all the cannon cast by the Confederacy, a minimum of 1 month to cast, finish, and mount such a weapon. For the larger Brook guns, it took the Selma Naval Ordnance Works in the neighborhood of 1,000 hours for completion. At such a rate of manufacture, it would take 4 years for Southern foundries to replace the heavy ordnance alone that was lost at Vicksburg. Although Confederate foundries produced field guns at a more rapid rate, it would take 1 full year for iron workers at Tredegar, Bologna, and a host of smaller foundries across the South to replace the 169 light field guns captured by the Federals during the campaign for Vicksburg. And this, of course, does not include the corresponding numbers of limbers, caissons, forge wagons, implements, harnesses, bridles, and the myriad of other accoutrements associated with artillery that was also lost during the campaign. Thus, rather than produce weapons to strengthen the armies in the field, Southern foundries were simply working to replace diminished supply. As events would prove, in the wake of the disasters of 1863 at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, the Confederacy did not have the luxury of time to replenish such a tremendous loss. In addition to the guns themselves, the Southern nation was deprived in part of the means by which to replace its lost artillery, for there were 2 foundries in Vicksburg, the smelters of which turned forever cold for the Confederacy when the city surrendered on July 4, 1863. The A.M. Paxton Foundry, and if you look at this particular photograph, immediately in the center of the photograph, you will note the A.M. Paxton Foundry, and the A.B. Reading Foundry, the latter of which produced at least 45 cannon for the Confederacy, had been a mainstay of the Vicksburg economy prior to the war and a vital part of Southern manufacturing during the conflict itself. In addition to cannon and munitions for artillery, These foundries produced iron for rails, boilers and steam gauges for steamboats and railroad engines, circular sawmills, water and gas pipes, farm tools, and implements of all kinds for agricultural, commercial, and residential use. The loss of these foundries further compounded the shortage of these items throughout the Confederacy and, although minimally, affected industrial output, the production of lumber, and even the cultivation of foodstuffs at a time of desperate and growing need. From the outset of the war, the importance of the Great River as a line of supply, communications, and operations was apparent to all. Although, in the words of Mark Twain, the river was too thick to drink and too thin to plow, the Mississippi River was regarded as the spinal column of America. Indeed, the silent water of the mighty river was then, as it remains to this date, the single most important economic feature of the continent, the very lifeblood of America, if you will. One contemporary wrote emphatically that the valley of the Mississippi is America, reflecting the depth of significance, nay, allow me to say religious fixation, in which the citizens of the North and South in the mid-19th century held the river. The Mississippi River and its tributaries were the interstate highways of the 19th century. These streams drained half the continent, and along their waters were steamers, flatboats, and vessels of all description, heavily laden with the rich agricultural produce of the land en route to world markets. The Crescent City, New Orleans, was the second busiest port in America in 1860. Only New York surpassed New Orleans in the number of vessels entering and leaving its docks. Upon the secession of the southern states, and especially Louisiana and Mississippi, the river was closed to unfettered navigation, which threatened to strangle northern commercial interest. It was imperative for the administration in Washington to regain control of the lower Mississippi River and thereby open that avenue of commerce to allow the rich agricultural produce of the Northwest to reach world markets. In America, then as now, economic importance translated to political importance, and it was of agonizing concern to Abraham Lincoln that the great waterway be opened to navigation as quickly as possible. Despite early successes at Henry and Donelson and at Shiloh, when that goal was not achieved by late 1862, the administration's anxiety reached new heights. Union General John McClernand, a former Democratic member of the Congress who represented the Springfield region of Illinois, wrote to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on November the 10th, "I am conscious that if something is not soon done to reopen that great highway, that a new party will spring into existence which will favor the recognition of the independence of the so-called Confederate States, with the view to eventual arrangements either by treaty or union for the purpose of effecting that object." McClernand's statements accurately assessed the political climate of the region, which reflected that of the nation as a whole. The climate of defeatism gave rise to Copperheads and Peace Democrats who grew in strength and numbers in key northwestern states. Their influence on the national level and the extent of the dissatisfaction with the Lincoln administration was revealed in dramatic fashion as the fall elections went against the Republicans. The Republican Party lost 23 seats in the House of Representatives, where its 59% margin of control dropped to just 46%, forcing the administration to form a coalition government until the elections of 1864. Political importance thus translated to military importance, and control of the Mississippi River became a cornerstone of the Anaconda Plan, which sought to split the Confederacy in two along the line of the Mississippi River and sever a major Confederate supply line that ran east-west through the city of Vicksburg, a line of supply, by the way, on which the armies of Robert E. Lee and Braxton Bragg, operating much farther to the east, relied on for supplies of food, clothing, and reinforcements of fresh troops. Ulysses S. Grant himself later wrote of the political considerations that influenced the development of his operations along the Mississippi River. The campaign of Vicksburg was suggested and developed by circumstances, he wrote. The elections of 1862 had gone against the prosecution of the war. Voluntary enlistments had nearly ceased, and the draft had been resorted to. This was resisted, and a defeat or backward movement would have made its execution impossible. A forward movement to a decisive victory was necessary. As important as the river was to the north, it was equally important to the south. In his biography, Jefferson Davis, The Man and His Hour, our friend Jack Davis notes the Confederate president's strategic dilemma of defending the vast circumference of the southern nation and its largest city, New Orleans. He emphasized that the most vital region that demanded immediate attention was the rest of the Mississippi River, from the Mississippi state line near Woodville north to the Kentucky and Missouri borders. This would be the lifeline by which men and material from the interior of the Confederacy would be moved to New Orleans, or equally critical imports sent upriver to nailheads that existed then at Memphis and Vicksburg for dispersal. At the same time, the river had to be held to keep open communications between the Confederacy east of the stream and to the west. Although New Orleans fell in April 1862 and Memphis in June of that same year, Confederate leaders sought desperately to retain control over as many miles of the Mississippi River as possible to maintain the connection between the Trans-Mississippi, that's the vast geographic region west of the river, and the Cis-Mississippi, the heartland of the Confederacy east of the stream, by concentrating their forces at defensible areas along the Mississippi. Among the sites selected, Port Hudson, Louisiana, and Grand Gulf and Vicksburg in Mississippi became the most powerful bastions. Vicksburg was the largest and most important of these posts. As all of you know from your study of geography, there were 3 states of the Southern Confederacy west of the Great River: Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, as well as the Indian territories that were militarily and politically aligned with the Confederacy. Fully 1/2 the landmass of the Confederate States of America was west of the Great River. In a December 1862 letter to Lieutenant General Theophilus Holmes, Jefferson Davis presented a keen appraisal of the military situation that his government faced. There are 2 prominent objectives in the program of the enemy, noted Davis. One is to get possession of the Mississippi River and open it to navigation. The other is to seize upon the capital of the Confederacy and hold this out as a proof that the Confederacy has no existence. Of the 2 objectives, he candidly admitted that the river was of greater importance, and in reference to Vicksburg, termed the city's possible loss to be a much greater calamity than would be the loss of Richmond. Davis echoed these sentiments in a speech to the Mississippi legislature on December 26, 1862, when he traveled to the Magnolia State to make a first-hand inspection of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana and assuage the fears of the populace as federal forces were in motion throughout the region. He stated that defense of Vicksburg and Port Hudson was vital to the Confederacy, and that a successful defense of the Mississippi River would conduce more than in any other way to the perpetuation of the Confederacy and the success of the cause. Defense of the twin bastions was indeed paramount, as they formed the connection between the Trans-Mississippi and Cis-Mississippi, which provided for the passage across the Great River of vital supplies, especially food, that were desperately needed by Confederate armies in the field, and increasingly so by a civilian population in want of sustenance. Following the loss of New Orleans and Memphis, Vicksburg became the major conduit through which supplies passed from one side of the river to the other, as it was the only city with rail links to the rest of the Confederacy. From Vicksburg, the Southern Railroad of Mississippi connected the city with Jackson and via Jackson points elsewhere in the Confederacy. West of the river, the tracks of the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Texas Railroad stretched to Monroe and the Washita River. The BS&T, as it was called, stretched from the Mexican border, helped stretch the supply line from the Mexican border to Virginia. To help support the war-torn eastern areas of the Confederacy, the Vicksburg Shreveport in Texas carried over its rails English rifles and ammunition that the rebels landed in Mexico and smuggled across the border to the Confederacy. Texas beef and grain, Louisiana sugar, salt and molasses, and much more. Indeed, the vast Trans-Mississippi region was a land of milk and honey, the fertile soils of which produced foodstuffs in abundance for the Confederacy. According to the preliminary report of the 8th Census, 1860, Arkansas ranked 7th in molasses, 10th in asses and mules. Louisiana ranked 1st in cane sugar, 1st in cane molasses, producing about 7/8 of all that produced in the United States. Texas ranked 1st in working cattle, 1st in neat cattle, or meaning domestic cows, 1st in sheep, 3rd in horses, 4th in milk cows, 4th in asses and swine, and 7th in mules. These three states alone combined annually produced over 50 million bushels of Indian corn, 2 million bushels of wheat, 5 million bushels of sweet potatoes, and 11 million pounds of butter. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, it was the Trans-Mississippi and not the Shenandoah that was the breadbasket of the Confederacy. It is important to further note that the region also produced 2 million pounds of wool and processed more than 1.5 million bales of cotton. Lead was also an essential item for Confederate armies that fought with increased desperation as the conflict continued into 1864, and most of the Southern lead fired on battlefields across the nation came from Trans-Mississippi region. But throughout the antebellum period, and during the war years themselves, Southern railroads could not compete in importance to the rivers that flowed silently to the sea, nor the steamboats that plied their muddy water. In Vicksburg, the heartbeat of the town emanated from the docks along the waterfront. Prior to the Civil War, steamboats from New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, and Louisville arrived daily in Vicksburg. To this could be added vessels from Cincinnati, Wheeling, and Pittsburgh that arrived in Vicksburg on a far less regular basis. With the advent of Civil War, the amount of boat traffic on the Mississippi and the number of vessels that tied up at the city dramatically fell. Yet the city continued to serve as an important port for the Confederacy, and its docks were generally piled high with white gold in its various forms. The white gold of which I speak, of course, cotton, sugar, and salt. And let's briefly take a look at these commodities, if we may. In 1861, the South produced 4.5 million bales of cotton, or 2/3 of the world's supply, and much of this was raised in the fertile lower Mississippi River Valley. Confederate foreign policy was based on King Cotton. Southern leaders were convinced that the key to success lay in gaining foreign recognition, and they viewed cotton as the great leverage. More than 3/4 of the cotton used in the textile mills of England and France came from the American South. Almost 1/4 of England's population depended in some way on the textile industry. It was believed by the authorities in Richmond that the need for cotton would compel England and France to intervene in the war and raise the Union blockade of southern ports in order to save their own economies. Orville Burton writes, although the South was never succeeded in convincing the foreign powers to intervene against the North, cotton diplomacy was successful in obtaining financial help from abroad. In all, the Confederacy realized almost $8 million in foreign exchange based on cotton that was used to purchase an array of materials from arms and equipments to warships. As important as they were to the Confederacy, the cotton lands of the lower Mississippi River Valley were equally important to the North and New England in particular. In 1860, there had been almost 5 million spindles in operation in New England that employed tens of thousands of people. That same year, more than 2 million bales of cotton processed through the port of New Orleans supplied those spindles with enough cotton to produce $100 million worth of cloth. By 1862, only 25% of those spindles were in active operation, and the cry for Southern cotton was heard loud and clear in Washington. New England had played a vital role in Abraham Lincoln's ascension to the presidency in 1860, as evidenced in part by his selection of Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as his running mate. Lincoln realized that he had to keep New England pacified and alleviate the cotton shortage if he were to be reelected in 1864 in order to continue to direct the war to a successful conclusion. Thus, it was imperative for the administration in Washington to reestablish control of the Mississippi River and its tributaries, to open the flow of cotton from the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. To do so, his land and naval forces had to silence the Confederate river batteries at Vicksburg. Briefly, if I may, as I'm running out of time, salt was another form of white gold that was of equal importance to the supplies of lead, corn, beef, pork, and horses, and other essential items funneled through Vicksburg from the Trans-Mississippi region. It is important to note that the preliminary report of the 8th Census in 1860 lists only 8 states as producing salt, which, as you all know, was essential to the curing and preservation of meat. Of these, only 2 were southern states, Virginia and Texas. During the war, salt was discovered in Louisiana as well, and the mines in New Iberia became the South's largest suppliers. Although figures are not available for Louisiana and Virginia, Texas alone produced 120,000 bushels of salt. Due to the increased demand for salt caused by mobilization of the troops and the need to feed Confederate armies in the field, the scarcity of this vital commodity quickly grew acute. On December 20th, 1862, in a joint address to the Mississippi legislature, Governor John J. Pettus informed his listeners, who included Jefferson Davis, that the most pressing want of our people at the present time is a supply of salt. Less than 7 months later, upon the fall of Vicksburg, the supply of salt from the mines in Texas and New Iberia, Louisiana, was cut. Salt rose dramatically in price and soon became worth its weight in gold. And it's interesting to point out, by 1864, the single largest appropriation of the states of Mississippi and Alabama was for a supply of salt to stave off imminent starvation of the civilian population. Without salt to cure and preserve meat, the beef necessary to feed the armies had to be shipped on the hoof. This further taxed the overstrained and rapidly deteriorating Confederate transportation system, which ultimately broke under the strain. This brings us to our third form of white gold, sugar. And again, as I'm running out of time, allow me to simply say by 1864, sugar became a commodity, just as money, and you traded sugar pound for meat. And the Confederate Commissary Department found that this was a most effective means of supplying the armies in the field. And as the Adjutant General wrote himself, that the only way we can supply our armies with beef in the fields is to purchase it by sugar. And with the cut of the Mississippi River, that supply of sugar was cut to the Sis, Mississippi. Other means would have to be found to supply the armies with meat. To give you some idea of the quantity of sugar that passed through Vicksburg, on the Southern Railroad of Mississippi, it had a carrying capacity of 300,000 tons of sugar per week. At the rate of trade, 300,000 tons of sugar would exchange for, 300 tons of sugar would exchange for 600,000 pounds of meat. Thus, the sugar passing through Vicksburg was enough to supply the South's principal army with its entire supply of beef at the 1864 ration issue. And so we come to a conclusion. Can we say that this Trans-Mississippi supply line and its significance was myth? Or was it in truth reality? You decide. But wait, there is more for you to consider. Among the results of this campaign, with the loss of Vicksburg and Port Hudson, not only was the river now under Union control, but hundreds of square miles of land changed hands. How many miles of land changed hands during the Gettysburg campaign? 0. Hundreds of square miles changed hands in the Vicksburg campaign. These lands provided President Lincoln with a vast region in which to test his Reconstruction policies and address the needs of the freedmen. Union victory at Vicksburg led to a dramatic increase in the enlistments of blacks from Louisiana and Mississippi in the Army and Navy of the United States. These recruits enabled the Union to use black troops in occupations of towns such as Vicksburg, Grand Gulf, Natchez, and Baton Rouge, and elsewhere, rather than white soldiers, combat veterans, who were thus freed to fight elsewhere. With Pemberton's army gone and Johnston's force no longer a threat, a large portion of Grant's army was able to move to Memphis. From the Queen City, it reconstructed the Memphis and Charleston Railroad en route to Chattanooga, where it helped raise the siege and open the pathway of invasion to the Deep South. If I have just a few moments here. Grant's campaign for Vicksburg remains the subject of examination and evaluation by modern soldiers and is required study at the United States Military Academy. In its May 1986 version of FM 100-5, the Field Manual on Operations, the United States Army boldly proclaims of Grant, his operations south of Vicksburg, fought in the spring of 1863, has been called the most brilliant campaign ever fought on American soil. It exemplifies the qualities of a well-conceived, violently executed offensive plan. The Army asserts in FM 100-5 that the same speed, surprise, maneuver, and decisive action will be required in the campaigns of the future. Indeed, for although replaced in the June 1993 version of FM 100-5 by an evaluation of Operation Desert Storm, as the campaign conducted by General Norman Schwarzkopf was a mirror image of the Vicksburg campaign, the Army's assertions has been validated. But there can be no doubt, as the article in North and South indicates, Vicksburg still has a long way to go before it finally settles into its deserved place in history. Thanks largely to the efforts of stalwart historians such as Edwin C. Bars, whose trilogy, The Vicksburg Campaign, has set the standard for campaign studies. Warren Grabo, author of 98 Days, A Geographer's View of the Vicksburg Campaign. Michael Ballard's work, Pemberton, Defender of Vicksburg, and others whose writing efforts will soon come to light. Vicksburg is finally coming to receive the just recognition it so richly deserves in the historiography of the Civil War, and may someday reclaim the level of significance it was accorded during the struggle for national identity. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Terry, the fall of Vicksburg obviously opens the river to Union shipping. Mm-hmm. Do we have any information on the volume of shipping that evolves over the next couple years, and were there threats to this shipping from hit-and-run attacks or guerrilla attacks in ports?
Question is, do we have any information on the quantity of shipping on the Mississippi River? Shipping on the Mississippi River would return to pre-war normalcy almost immediately. So tremendous quantities of materials are now being moved by boat downriver to New Orleans and via New Orleans to world markets. By moving these supplies now downriver as they did prior to the Civil War, that certainly freed up northern railroads for greater transportation of military supplies, especially the military operations during the campaigns of '64 and into 1865. Were there hit and run? There were a few, but they were insignificant. You did have Confederate flying artillery units, as they would call, that would race up to the banks of the Mississippi River, fire their small guns, and these are small pop guns, if you will, 2-pounders and 6-pounders at Union vessels on the Mississippi River, but they in no way interdicted that supply line whatsoever.
Terry, it seemed from the presentation that the VS&T Railroad still was in operation all the way to the fall of Vicksburg, unless I misunderstood. Could Grant's army not have cut it prior to that when they were operating in Louisiana?
The question deals with the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Texas Railroad. That's a rail line that runs west from the hamlet of DeSoto, which is opposite Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Despite its grandiloquent name, the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Texas Railroad only ran for 80 miles from DeSoto over to Monroe, Louisiana. Then there was another 20-mile stretch running westward from Shreveport toward the Texas border. This rail line would be cut first by nature when, due to a freshet, a bridge across the Washita River was knocked out of commission. But in the early operations for Vicksburg in December of 1862, Major General William T. Sherman saw to it that a Union brigade was landed in Louisiana with orders to knock that railroad out of commission, and they would tear up several miles of the track. So although the BS&T is knocked out of commission in December of 1862, it is replaced immediately by road transportation, and still those supplies would then be ferried across the river to Vicksburg.
With the amount of supplies lost at Vicksburg, was there any pressure on Pemberton to try and save that and break out?
Was there any effort on John Pemberton to break out? Bear in mind that Pemberton is a northerner by birth. He hails from the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Due to his northern birth, he was distrusted by many in the ranks, including his subordinate officers, and Pemberton was keenly aware of the mistrust that existed of him within the Army. Now, Pemberton was an indecisive man by nature, and that indecision was compounded by the level of distrust that existed of him within the Army. Following the inland campaign, when he's forced back into the city's defenses, not only is the Army badly mauled, but Pemberton's confidence in himself is completely shattered. All he wants to do is stay in the city, rest, and reorganize. His military superior, Joseph E. Johnston, is telling him to get out. We cannot save both the Vicksburg and the Army, and of the two, it's more important to save the Army. So he tells Pemberton to get out. Pemberton replies that, I don't think you fully appreciate the significance of the city I'm ordered to defend. He is under orders from Jefferson Davis, a much higher authority than Joseph E. Johnston, to hold Vicksburg at all cost. And that's what he intends to do by remaining in the city. And he will await relief. And throughout the summer of 1863, the authorities in Richmond will attempt to concentrate sizable enough forces to break through Grant's encircling siege lines and rescue Pemberton's army. Those forces, known as the Army of Relief, were under the command of Joseph E. Johnston, and they would concentrate in the Jackson-Canton area about 45 to 50 miles east of Vicksburg. But quite frankly, Johnston has no intention of marching on Vicksburg and doing battle with Grant. Finally, by late June, Johnston will admit to John Pemberton by correspondence, I am too weak to save Vicksburg. Consequently, by late June, Pemberton, realizing he has been left to his own devices, will actually contemplate a breakout attempt. On July the 1st, he will send out a confidential circular to his subordinates, asking about the conditions of the troops, asking if they are strong enough to undergo the hardships required by a successful breakout attempt. He will receive those replies on July the 2nd, and all of them are in the negative. Because by the end of June, this garrison has been under siege for 6 weeks. Their rations have been cut first to 3/4 rations, then to half, then to quarter. They were then cut again, and yet again, and yet again. And by the end of June, this garrison was subsisting on just a handful of peas and rice issued once a day per man. Even their water was rationed to just 1 cup per man per day. And in the heat of a Mississippi summer, on such limited quantities of food and water, the suffering among the garrison in Vicksburg was intense. By the end of June, Pemberton's army has dwindled from 30,000 effectives to fewer than 18,000 still in the trenches. And as one Confederate soldier noted, take a look about you. Look into the eyes of the few who remain steadfast to the end. Surely you too must sense the hopelessness of our situation in this doomed city. He said that the men who stand to the trenches, their eyes are glazed over. Their cheeks are hollow. You can count their every bone. They've given up all heart for the fight, and in what is worse, they seem to have lost their very souls. And so all of these replies to John Pemberton are in the negative. That evening, July 2nd, Pemberton will convene a council of his subordinate officers, his division and brigade commanders, and he will say, "Gentlemen, I have read your response." And he goes down the line, looks each man straight in the eyes and said, "Is this an accurate assessment of the troops under your command?" And when they all said it was, John Pemberton says, "Then there is no recourse left me but to surrender this city." And so he does at least investigate and contemplate a breakout attempt, but by the time he does, it is entirely too late to do so. Other questions? Sir, I think you had a question. Nope, no more. Folks, thank you very much.